Most people make the same mistake when it comes to empaths. They assume that because an empath is patient, they are permanent. Because an empath forgives, they will always return. Because an empath understands, they will always stay. And because an empath gives endless chances, they believe there will always be one more. But there is something many people never realize until it's too late. Empaths do not leave when they are angry. They do not leave after the first disappointment. They do not leave after one mistake. In fact, most empaths stay far longer than they should. They stay through confusion. They stay through broken promises. They stay through disrespect. They stay through emotional exhaustion. Not because they enjoy suffering, because they genuinely believe things can improve. They see potential where others see problems. They see possibilities where others see dead ends. And they often hold on to hope long after most people would have walked away. That is why the moment an empath is truly done is so powerful. Because by the time they reach that point, they have already spent months, sometimes years, trying to save what was breaking. They have already given chances, already had conversations, already explained their feelings, already tried to understand every side of the situation. The decision doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, like a candle burning down one drop of wax at a time. Most people never notice it happening. They assume everything is fine because the empath is still there, still answering messages, still showing up, still trying. But internally, something is changing. The empath is watching, listening, learning. Every broken promise leaves a mark. Every act of disrespect leaves a mark. Every time their feelings are ignored leaves a mark. And while each mark may seem small on its own, eventually they begin forming a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore. This is what many people misunderstand about empaths. They are incredibly forgiving, but forgiveness does not erase awareness. An empath may forgive a behavior. That does not mean they forget it happened. They may understand why someone acted a certain way. That does not mean they stop seeing the consequences. And over time, those observations accumulate. The empath starts noticing something they didn't notice before. The apologies stay the same, the promises stay the same, the explanations stay the same, but the behavior never changes. At first, they try harder, they communicate more clearly, they become more patient, more understanding, more supportive. Because empaths often believe that if they can just explain things correctly, the other person will finally understand. But eventually, reality begins teaching a painful lesson. Not everyone misunderstands you. Some people understand perfectly. They simply have no intention of changing. That realization hits differently because it forces the empath to confront something they have been avoiding, the possibility that their effort is not the solution. For someone who has spent years fixing problems, carrying emotional weight, and helping others, this can be difficult to accept. They want to believe more effort will work, more patience will work, more love will work. But there comes a moment when evidence becomes stronger than hope. And that is where the transformation begins. The empath stops listening to words. They start watching actions. They stop focusing on intentions. They start focusing on patterns. And patterns tell a story that excuses cannot hide. The story becomes clear. The relationship is surviving because one person is carrying most of the weight. One person is doing most of the understanding. One person is doing most of the forgiving. One person is doing most of the sacrificing. And that person is the empath. This realization creates emotional exhaustion unlike anything they have felt before. Not because they suddenly care less, because they finally see how much they have been carrying. Imagine holding a heavy backpack for years. At first, the weight feels manageable. Then it becomes normal. You adapt to it. You stop noticing how heavy it is. But the moment you take it off, you realize how exhausted you truly were. That is exactly what happens when an empath begins seeing reality clearly. They start realizing how much emotional weight they have been carrying for everyone else. How many problems they tried to solve. How many emotions they tried to manage. How many relationships they tried to save. And perhaps most painfully, how often they neglected themselves in the process. This is usually the stage where people around them become confused, because the empath starts changing, not dramatically, subtly. They become quieter, more observant, less reactive, less willing to argue, less willing to explain themselves repeatedly. Others mistake this silence for weakness, but it is actually the opposite. The empath is no longer trying to convince anyone. They are evaluating. They are deciding. They are asking themselves questions they never asked before. How much longer can I keep doing this? Why am I fighting so hard for something that keeps hurting me? Why am I giving more than I receive? What am I losing by staying? These questions create a shift that often happens long before the relationship ends. Emotionally, the empath begins stepping back, not because they want to, because they have to. Their energy can no longer sustain the imbalance. Their heart can no longer ignore reality. And little by little, the connection starts changing. The empath becomes less attached to the outcome, less attached to fixing things, less attached to proving their value. This is often the most dangerous moment for anyone who has taken the empath for granted, because it looks calm, it looks harmless. There are no dramatic threats, no emotional explosions, no obvious warnings. But beneath the surface, the empath is reaching a conclusion. A conclusion that once reached is almost impossible to reverse. They are beginning to understand that love is not supposed to require endless suffering, that respect should not have to be earned repeatedly, that relationships should not survive solely because one person refuses to give up. And when that understanding finally becomes clear, something happens that changes everything. The empath starts preparing to let go, not publicly, not loudly, internally. And once that process begins, the end may be much closer than anyone realizes, because the empath is approaching the moment that most people never see coming, the moment when they finally decide they have had enough. Because the empath is approaching the moment that most people never see coming, the moment when they finally decide they have had enough. And when that moment arrives, it rarely looks the way people expect. Most imagine dramatic endings, explosive arguments, angry confrontations, one final emotional battle. But the truth is often much quieter. The empath simply stops fighting, stops chasing, stops trying to hold together something that keeps falling apart. For years, they may have been the glue holding everything together, the one making compromises, the one initiating difficult conversations, the one trying to understand, the one trying to repair, the one trying to save the relationship. Now, for the first time, they stop. And that silence speaks louder than any argument ever could, because when an empath reaches their limit, they don't usually leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they cared for too long without seeing change. That distinction matters. People often assume the empath became cold, bitter, heartless, but that's rarely true. The empath still feels everything, still remembers the good moments, still understands the other person's struggles, still wishes things could have been different. The difference is that understanding no longer outweighs reality. Compassion no longer overrides self-respect. Hope no longer blinds them to patterns. And that changes everything. The empath begins seeing the relationship through a different lens, not through promises, not through intentions, not through potential, through results. And results tell a story that emotions often try to ignore. The same problems keep repeating. The same conversations keep happening. The same wounds keep reopening. The same cycle keeps continuing. At some point, the empath realizes they are not trapped by love. They are trapped by hope. Hope that things will improve. Hope that someone will finally understand. Hope that effort will eventually be reciprocated. Hope that tomorrow will look different than yesterday. But when tomorrow keeps looking exactly the same, hope starts losing its power, and reality starts taking its place. This is where the final shift happens. The empath stops asking how to save the relationship. They start asking how to save themselves. That question changes everything. Because once self-preservation becomes more important than preservation of the relationship, the dynamic can never fully return to what it was. The empath starts protecting their energy, protecting their peace, protecting their emotional well-being. And something surprising happens. The guilt begins fading, not immediately, but gradually. For years, guilt may have kept them stuck. Guilt for disappointing people, guilt for creating boundaries, guilt for putting themselves first, guilt for leaving situations that no longer served them. But eventually they realize something important. Choosing yourself is not betrayal. Protecting yourself is not selfishness. Walking away from repeated harm is not cruelty. It's wisdom. And wisdom changes the way an empath sees everything. They start recognizing that not every relationship is meant to last forever. Not every connection is healthy. Not every person deserves unlimited access to their heart. That realization is painful, because empaths naturally want to see the best in people. They naturally want to believe in growth, in healing, in second chances. But wisdom teaches balance. It teaches that seeing the best in someone should never require ignoring the worst. It teaches that love should not require constant suffering. It teaches that boundaries are not walls, they are protection. Once those lessons sink in, the empath becomes different. Not harder, stronger. There is a difference. A hard person closes their heart. A strong person protects it. The empath learns how to do exactly that. They stop giving endless chances to people who repeatedly waste them. Stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. Stop sacrificing their peace to maintain unhealthy connections. And when they do, something fascinating happens. The people who once took them for granted often become alarmed because they notice the change. The empath no longer reacts the same way, no longer argues the same way, no longer begs for understanding, no longer tries to prove their value. The old patterns stop working. The guilt trips stop working. The manipulation stops working. The emotional pressure stops working. And suddenly the person who always stayed seems ready to leave. This often shocks people, not because the signs weren't there, because they ignored them. They mistook patience for permanence, forgiveness for weakness, loyalty for dependency. They assumed the empath would always be there. And that assumption becomes their biggest mistake. Because once an empath reaches the point of being truly done, the decision has usually been forming for a very long time. Long before anyone noticed. Long before anyone took it seriously. Long before anyone believed it was possible. The emotional goodbye often happens before the physical goodbye. By the time the empath finally walks away, they have already spent countless nights processing the pain, countless days questioning themselves, countless moments hoping things would improve. The decision wasn't impulsive, it was earned through repeated disappointments, repeated patterns, repeated reminders that nothing was changing. That is why there is often no going back. Not because the empath is incapable of forgiveness, because they finally accepted reality. And acceptance is powerful. Once you truly accept what something is, it becomes difficult to keep pretending it is something else. The empath no longer needs closure from the other person, no longer needs validation, no longer needs one final explanation. They have already seen enough, already learned enough, already endured enough, and that awareness creates freedom. The freedom to stop carrying relationships alone. The freedom to stop sacrificing themselves for people who would not do the same. The freedom to choose peace over chaos. Growth over attachment. Self-respect over emotional survival. This is why when an empath is truly done, there is often no going back. Because they are not walking away from a person. They are walking away from a pattern that cost them too much. A pattern that asked them to abandon themselves. A pattern that convinced them that suffering was proof of love. And once they finally break free from that pattern, they discover something remarkable. Peace. The kind of peace they spent years searching for in other people, only to realize it was waiting for them on the other side of letting go. That is the moment everything changes. The moment the empath stops trying to save what keeps hurting them. The moment they stop choosing potential over reality. The moment they stop abandoning themselves in the name of love. And when that moment arrives, they don't look back. Not because they never cared, but because they finally learned that caring about someone should never require losing yourself. And once that lesson is learned, there truly is no going back.